can. Two useful approaches are the Panzerfaust and the pillow fight. I used to work in a juvenile detention facility. I spent a lot of time working the night shift, which, when you're not booking new prisoners or dealing with emergencies, means hours and hours of sitting in central control trying to stay awake and monitoring radio traffic. Conversation with any willing ear becomes important to stay alert. In the wee hours of the one shift, a coworker asked me, "Steve, why, in all your traveling, didn't you end up marrying a nice Tibetan girl and bringing her home?" I paused and said, "Well, I couldn't see myself marrying outside my race." The instant response was, "That's racist." Seriously. I replied calmly, "Not really. I'm proud of my heritage and honor my family line, and I want all my descendants down through the years to be recognizably us." 3 long seconds passed. Then she said in a quiet voice, "You're right. I could never see myself with anyone other than a white man." Consider what happened here. I had a rare opening, no interruptions, no one else around, a friendly conversation based on mutual respect. I took my opportunity, aimed, fired off my metaphorical round, and observed for impact. It was like using one of those old German Panzerfausts in the war movies, which was a sort of bazooka often used against tanks. You wouldn't get a second chance. Your timing and delivery had to be impeccable. Some of your red-pilling encounters will be just like that, with the right opening at precisely the right time. In contrast, there is the pillow fight. This is when you gradually, over days and weeks and maybe even months, present documented facts, not in an unpleasant way, not in ridicule, not aggressively, but in a bantering or a casual way. The cumulative effect can be as powerful as the Panzerfaust, but subtler. You wear down the opposition. Circled passages from select literature, short and making a specific point. Statistics, maybe a quote by either a friend or foe. Things our enemies have said can often be the most devastating evidence against them. The repetitive, gentle, soft nature of this approach prompted me to call this method the pillow fight. And besides, pillow rhymes with Panzerfaust. However you choose to do it, do it. Pick a target you respect and who respects you. Someone who won't dox you or turn against you, and make it happen. This is the struggle we face, and we're all on the front lines. Load up with red pills and start delivering them to an unsuspecting person, or even a suspecting one, near you. This is Stephen McNallen saying thank you for supporting my work, and keep on fighting. The best.
I'm conflicted about the idea of red pilling. I understand that it's something that has been co-opted, claimed, branded to hell and back by the right wing since the rise of Trump, since the rise of the alt-right, since the right wing of the skeptic community started to adopt this concept of conservatism as the new punk. This idea that you are going to awaken something in your viewer that was not already there. I don't think that you're going to convert someone to white nationalism that wasn't already. I don't think there's a lot of scientific evidence for this spontaneously activated political transformation. I think that from my experience and from my research on the topic, and my own, let's start from my own personal experience. When I was a kid, I used to lean right because my father had been into left-wing politics in the 1970s, and then he became a Reagan Democrat in the 1980s. So I grew up in a sort of a center-right environment. You know, my dad was one of those people who kind of went center-right in the 1980s. He got a corporate job in advertising and stuff. And so I remember as a kid being like a fan of Ronald Reagan, because Ronald Reagan was very much so like the Saturday morning president. He was the Saturday morning cartoon audience's president. I think that he was very good at providing very simplistic narratives for those who weren't politically informed. And being fucking 8 years old is a good way to not be politically informed. That carried over into, you know, my junior Republicanism carried over into the administration of George Bush Sr., which was between the ages of 8 and 12 for me. I actually did a book report for school in like 5th grade, maybe 4th or 5th grade, where I celebrated a biography that I read about George H.W. Bush. And I think that, again, it was a child's mind being fed a very simplistic narrative about political meanings, a very simplistic, Rambo-formed, Chuck Norris-fed political leaning. For me, the transition into radical leftism, and as I have gotten older, knock on wood, I have become more radical in my left-leaning tendencies. I didn't have a red-pilling experience. It was a gradual growth from supporting the Democratic Party during the end of the Clinton administration, where I was about 16 or 17 years old. I was starting to read more literature about history. In high school, I was very, very preoccupied with history class and the history of liberal democracy. You know, I was a big fan of FDR, and at the time, I perceived FDR, I perceived the Democratic Party as, you know, the party of the Civil Rights Act, and had a very kind of American history informed liberalism. You know, I thought the Democratic Party was where it's at. I thought that was the way forward for marginalized and oppressed people, because I did sort of consume the New Deal narrative uncynically. So that's me as a teenager, continuing on my political journey. And then into my college years, I didn't go to college in my 20s. So with that like my early 20s, I didn't immediately go to school after high school. I wanted to take some time to work and to like live, to get some worldliness and world experience, and I'm glad that I did, because it would have been a straight line from the Catholic high school that I went to into the private university that I was accepted into, and then out into the workforce. And I think that I would have been more corporate. I think I would have been more predisposed to free market liberalism, because I would have been insulated by struggle. My father had a good job, and he could afford, even though we lived in the inner city, he could afford on his salary, because I know that an affirmative action program helped him get through university and then get a good paying corporate job. I think that if I had followed the path that was outlined for me by my father, I would have missed the boat working class struggle, I wouldn't have been able to understand from the ground level where I am now, the hardships of the working class, the check to check, the inflation of day-to-day goods and commodities, the cost of gas, fucking up your rent money. All these like really important things were learned by experience. I think that my capacity for empathy when we talk about economic issues, when we talk about left-wing economics, left-wing social issues, was informed by the fact that instead of going to school immediately and allowing politics to be an entirely academic endeavor, I lived it. So the struggling of the proletariat was not abstract. It wasn't like something that I had a polite discussion with college Republicans about in the lunchroom, and then we all went back to our dorms and lived our little privileged lives. The public library. That's where I acquired my radical left-wing bent. That's where I discovered, the New York Public Library is one hell of a great public library system. And I discovered the writings of Noam Chomsky. And he debunked, a lot of the myths about the Democratic Party. That's what I needed. I needed someone to debunk a lot of the American mythology that was built around JFK. A lot of the American mythology that was built around Woodrow Wilson or FDR's New Deal. Explaining that the kind of the difference between liberalism and the left, because the left spectrum in America is so tapered off. It is so softened compared to the rest of the world, particularly the developing world. And reading Noam Chomsky's work and reading then Chomsky led to Zinn, Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, and that debunked a lot of the Columbus narrative. Zinn led to Slavoj Žižek, which gave me more philosophical insights into the structures of power and the history of Europe, which I didn't know a lot about the history of Europe from the European perspective. I didn't know a lot about communism from someone who lived inside a communist state during the existence of the Soviet Union. And I'm not an authoritarian communist. I'm not interested in resurrecting Stalinism or Maoism, but I was at least able to get a less filtered telling of what IRL authoritarian communism is like. So I went from being a liberal-leaning Democrat to reading the works of Chomsky and Zinn, very specifically being oriented in the exploitation of South and Central America. I became like a Che Guevara, Fidel Castro leaning communist. Became proper red. R-E-D. I became a militant red communist. And then my journey continued. My journey continued, and I kept on looking for true left. What's true left? True left. Where is the most? For me, true left is about finding the most compassionate position, the position that causes the least harm, the condition that enriches and tends to the most people. That's what the pure left is. the journey towards pure left for me has been. So I continued to read, and then I read books that, like I said, Slavoj Žižek, for example, that sort of debunked. And I read a lot of Chomsky's writings about anarchism, libertarian socialism, and it started to debunk for me also the idea of an authoritarian communist utopia. You know, it sort of it didn't harshly condemn the Cubans, but it did illuminate to me over time that authoritarian communism, you know, reading Emma Goldman, for example, her disappointment in the revolution in Russia becoming authoritarian and brutal and gulags and all that stuff, that again was part of this long journey towards where I am now, where I feel most comfortable and where I feel I always was inside. The internal self was red and black, anarcho-communism, anarcho-syndicalism. I hope I pronounced that properly, but that is basically like a libertarian form of socialism. It took so long to get here, and I can't say that there was one red pill. There were a dozen red pills, and they weren't some schmuck on the subway telling me about the preservation of my race, and it wasn't some person at the airport talking to me about a Muslim rape epidemic. It was a process of self-education. I woke myself and got awoken by life, by life experience. So much of the red pilling on the right is based on rumor, on embracing hysteria and conjecture. I heard so-and-so thing is happening in Sweden. I heard so-and-so thing is happening in Britain. I've heard there's no-go zones. So much of right-wing red pilling is based upon telling you that your worst fears and existing paranoias are valid. Everything you already believed about black people, guess what? It's true. Everything you already believed about Muslims, guess what? It's been true this whole time. Oh, did you have a pre-existing anti-Semitism? Well, you're right. The Bilderbergs. The Jews really are behind everything. And then it sort of leads out from there into following this tunnel of infinite confirmation. For me, my political journey was informed by the facts leading me deeper, and new sources informing me that there was more to the story and presenting data. Chomsky's writing and Zinn's writing is about presenting data and like historical documentation of the actuality rather than the legend of the Liberal Democratic Party, the actuality rather than the narrative of the authoritarian Communist Party and communist revolutions in the Third World and Eastern Europe. I was informed by truth. To always go further, to always dig deeper, to question power is the true red pill.